Welcome everyone to our second research roundtable on consumer protection issues, where we hear from some researchers from the University of Oregon who are doing funded research made possible by the shark scheme lawsuit. Today we're actually going to start with assistant professor Nathan Warren, who's at the BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo. Professor Warren graduated from the University of Oregon in 2021 with a PhD in marketing. And we funded his research when he was just finishing up his graduate studies. So with that, Professor Warren, we're excited to hear from you.
All right, thank you. The paper is The Divergent Effects of Employees and Bystanders Observing Customers Select Tips. And again, I just want to say thank you so much to the committee for supporting this, to Professor Tibbet and Debbie for helping organize everything. It's great to be able to, I'm really grateful it's a lunchtime meeting because I'm zooming in from Norway right now. So I've got my picture of the Oregon coast behind me, but otherwise I'm in Norway. So grateful that I can be there with you today. So yeah, this paper basically looks at this question that we see in this cartoon here, which is what happens when someone's going to pay for a tip and an employee is staring at you as you're making that selection. That's the basic question that we're looking at today. So there you go. We're going to look at this in terms of two things. Our first main focus is just, is the employee looking at you? So are they observing or not observing as the customer selecting a tip? And then we're also going to look at this kind of second level question of, does it matter who is watching? Does it matter if it's the employee who's going to presumably benefit from the tip, or if it's just some random bystander, some other customer in line who might be able to see the tip, right? And we think this is an interesting theoretical question, kind of for a number of reasons I'll get into, but it's also interesting just from a practical point of view, because none of this existed 15 years ago, right? None of this existed until we had these digital touch screens where people were tipping. In an old-fashioned tipping setting, you get a little piece of paper in a folded envelope, and it's mostly only when you're out to eat at a fancy sit-down restaurant. And now we've got these touch screens everywhere. If you go out to eat on 13th Street, if you go out to eat almost anywhere where you've got a counter service, these touch screens are just everywhere. And the closeness, the proximity between employees, bystanders, and paying customers is just pretty, it's this new phenomenon, and it's pretty intense. And so we don't know anything really about it. So we set out to figure out what would happen. There's both donations literature, which is kind of relevant, right? Tipping falls into this category of voluntary payments, right? It's giving someone money, but you don't have to. And so the closest things are really charitable donations and this other phenomenon called pay what you want pricing, which is basically what it sounds like. You get to choose how much you want to pay. And there is a little research in both of those, basically saying that, sometimes people like to give. We give because we want to tell ourselves that we're generous people. We want to show the people around us that we're generous, right? So that's one side of giving. But the other side is that we give because we feel forced to give, right? That we feel like we're being pressured into giving, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to operationalize those as both generosity signaling and perceived control. Those are going to be the two different factors that we're going to suggest might fit into this model of answering the question of what happens when you're watching someone pick a tip amount. And so because we weren't too sure what would happen, we figured to start off and go out and just ask people, right? Just ask them, what do you think? What happens to you? What's your experience like? And we also asked some employees what their experiences were like on this. We wanted kind of both sides of the picture. So on the left there, you see kind of the customer side of things. The customers say, when someone watches me, I feel intimidated. I feel forced. I feel like I need to provide some sort of tip. But when the employee's not looking, then I feel a lot more comfortable. There's no pressure to tip, right? And so that suggests to us these feelings, right? It feels a lot better to feel comfortable and no pressure. but it doesn't really tell us what's going to happen with tip amounts, right? If you feel pressured to tip, then you might tip them more than if you don't feel pressure. So we have this possibility of people feeling one way and behaving another, which is always interesting. Then the employee side, so that's the stuff over on the right here. We had one employee talk about the importance of other customers. She said, you know, customers will sometimes make a big show about when they're tipping, you know, to try and show off to their friends. This was a barista at a fancy Seattle coffee restaurant. And then we had two employees we talked to who actually were working at a restaurant near the University of Oregon. And these were two women working the same shift at the same time, the same day, just two counters right next to each other. And one woman says, I stare at people, right? I stare them down. They should be tipping me. I stare them down so they give me money. And the other woman sitting next to her, same age, everything, she was just like, no, you know, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I divert my eyes. I kind of, it's their choice, right? So what we see from this is that customers have clear feelings, but they don't really tell us what they're how it's gonna affect their tipping. And employees don't know what to do. They don't really know what the best practices are. And so first thing we set out to do was just run a field simulation. Basically, this is a test we ran. You know, we've got COVID going on. We're trying to keep things pretty safe. And what we did was we set up an online pizza shop, basically. And to make it a little more realistic, we told 3 people you'd win a raffle. If you win the raffle, we're going to order a pizza for you, and we're going to pay the tip that you say. And then you get to keep the rest of the money, right? And so it makes the tip that they select a little bit more realistic, right? Because they're actually going to pay it if they win this lottery. So they select a pizza order, they pick a tip amount, and then half of the people see this manipulation down here, which is inspired from a old donations based manipulation, where they basically say if people feel like someone's watching them, then they're going to behave like someone's watching them. And so we say, hey, here's this pop-up, this guy is saying, hey, I look forward to delivering you. It's kind of this virtual presence. And what we find is that virtual presence leads to significantly lower tips, actually. Just the suggestion that someone is watching leads people to leave a 13 or 12.8% tip instead of a 14.4% tip. So here we're finding out this initial question: when people feel watched, they seem to tip a little bit less. So the second study was a bit more complicated, right? We're trying to get into why employee observation is harmful, right? And so we had seen before that, yes, they're watching leads to slightly lower tips, but we wanted to know why that was, and we also wanted to know more of a customer response, customer satisfaction, how customers feel about it, right? And so this down here, customer responses, this is a collection of different measures. It's things basically, how satisfied are you with the transaction? And so what we find is that when the employee is not observing, so this is when customers feel like they have privacy, right? First off, they feel more generous, right? They feel like the things they're doing, they're authentic, they're true to themselves, they feel good about it. It's like, oh, I picked that tip because I wanted to tip. And so what happens is that generosity leads to them tipping a little more, and it leads them to feel a lot better about the whole transaction. But there's this other story going on with perceived control, and it goes in the opposite direction for tip amounts. And what that means is that when people aren't being watched, they feel like they have a lot of control. And when they have that control, they feel like they don't have to tip, right? And this could be because we're talking about context. We're not in a restaurant setting where there's this norm of tipping. We're in these kind of contested areas, cafes, places like that, where there's not a certain fact that you have to tip. So people feel like they've got a lot of control, they've got a lot of choice, and they tip less. And so what we see is this generosity and this perceived control basically fighting it out on tip amount. And so what we end up seeing is that, again, it's the watching leads to a slightly lower tip amount than giving customers privacy. So that generosity effect is a little stronger. So again, the overall takeaway here is giving customers some privacy, they'll tip a little bit more, and they'll feel a whole lot better. And this is the story that we really can lean into a lot here, is this customers feeling better. This is kind of a messy slide here, so I'll walk you through it a little bit, but basically it's this customers. So this is the paying customer is in the middle, and then the employee is either watching or not. Oh, sorry, I got those upside down. And then the bystander is either watching or not. And what we find here, first off, is in the tip amount space, we see that when everyone's watching, so down here in this bottom right quadrant, when everyone's watching, the social pressure is up high, the ability to signal generosity to this person's high, tip amounts go way up. And that's the high tip zone, is when everyone's watching. And then the lowest tipping is when you just have that employee watching, but no bystander. And so again, we see that kind of negative effect of the employee alone watching. And then when we think about that customer response, customer satisfaction measure, again, we see this big negative, harmful effect of employees watching. We don't see that the customer has any effect on this, the bystander. So it doesn't matter if there's people in line or not, people just hate being watched while they pick a tip. If the employee, the person getting the tip, is watching it, right? And this lines up with some old donation stuff. Basically, when the most famous experiment was, they had a Salvation Army Santa Claus, and basically they discovered that people try to avoid Salvation Army Santa Clauses, right? And it's not that people, no one wants to say no to them, so the best thing they do is they try to avoid it, right? So this is kind of, here people don't like being watched, they can't avoid it, and so what they do is they take it out afterwards by saying, I didn't enjoy that interaction. So our takeaways here, first off, we're showing that there's two different pathways kind of affecting tipping. There's this idea of feeling in control, and there's this generosity piece. And the control and generosity piece seem to be going in opposite directions in terms of tip amounts, but in terms of customer responses, everyone wants to feel in control. Everyone wants to feel that they're a good, generous person. This means that observation can have different outcomes. So employee observation always detrimental to customer responses, but can be good for tips or bad for tips, depending on whether or not there's a crowd. In terms of managerial stuff, and this is kind of my takeaway for any managers who might be watching this video, train your employees to give customers some privacy while they're tipping, right? Tip amounts might go up a little bit if you give them privacy. We think that we'd like to do some more research on that, and that's my next slide, is about how we really want to dig into that tip bit. But we're pretty positive that really customers do not enjoy being watched. They're not comfortable with it, and it's not good for business. That being said, when things are crowded, when there's that social pressure from other customers, that might have a positive effect on tips. Kind of just went through that. This is kind of an overall summary slide. If anyone wants to pause the video and watch, kind of just gives you the managerial takeaways. And then this is the update on kind of what we've been doing recently. And basically, we've spent the past 8 months trying to run field studies, and COVID has been a persistent hassle, unsurprisingly. That hasn't been the only problem. We've also found at one point we had a couple different delivery drivers working for us or working with us. And we found that when some delivery drivers look at customers as they're tipping, their tips go way up. And when other delivery drivers do the exact same thing, their tips go way down. We've got some sort of employee effect that we haven't figured out yet. We're getting a lot of small studies. We had a food truck that we partnered with in Eugene. We got about 80 observations. They were trending in the direction we expected, but nowhere near significant because there just wasn't enough observations. And we had another observational study at another cafe that, again, very small, non-significant effects kind of going in the direction we expected. And so we're kind of struggling with getting good field data to really validate what we think is happening from our controlled studies, having trouble validating that out in the wild. So some takeaways there, we've kind of already covered these, but feel good about customers really dislike being observed. And I think that aligns pretty well with kind of the overall pitch of this grant in terms of, if we're going to protect consumers, look after their welfare, give them some privacy as they're selecting a tip amount, right? Whether or not it affects tip amounts, we're a little uncertain, but we know that it's good for business and that your customers will be more satisfied. They'll feel happier about the transaction. And so our next steps here, we had this under review at one journal. We decided that we're going to target a different journal because we weren't able to get the field data we wanted. And we're just going to really get this out there and try to emphasize just the managerial benefits of giving customers privacy. And then we're going to continue to search for businesses. If anyone here happens to own a food truck or something like that, or a small restaurant, and you want to talk to me afterwards, please send me an email. I'd love to chat. But we're trying to get in touch with a couple different businesses to get a bit more data. But in the meantime, we are going to try and get just the smaller effects paper out the door.